So good afternoon and welcome to our Way Forward Workshop Leader Lunch Break. We're thrilled to welcome today Kevin Clayton. Kevin serves as Vice President of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement with the Cleveland Cavaliers. And if you wonder how he got there, well, his path to prominence in the NBA actually began on the courts of Shaker High School. He continued on to play hoops at Wilmington College and then had a successful career in business with executive positions spanning 3 decades and 4 coasts, from California to New York and Michigan to Florida and Georgia. He launched his career at Procter & Gamble and has served as the Vice President of Global Diversity at Russell Corporation, as well as Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the American Cancer Society and Mercy Health System. Kevin answered the call from the Cavs to return home in April of 2019, and immediately he became a strong voice within that organization and the greater Cleveland community. His work within the Cavs includes the Cavs, of course, the Cleveland Monsters, the Canton Charge, the Cleveland Gladiators, 2KL Cavs Legion, and everything that happens at Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse. Within that multifaceted organization, he leads a culture of inclusion where he lives his belief that a leader needs to create an environment where everyone feels that they can be themselves. He's also been instrumental in creating a culture at the Cavs where the team is in the forefront of social justice. They were one of the first to recognize Juneteenth as a team holiday, and they partnered with the NAACP in the Time to Talk series. If you happened to catch Cranes this morning, you saw an interview with Kevin Clayton where he was asked what lessons did he learn in 2020 and what are his hopes for 2021. His response, 2020 forced me to think outside of my comfort zone and exercise muscles that I had not typically used and depended upon. In order to be successful, I had to be more innovative, more creative, and courageous. Hopes for 2021, and this sets us up beautifully for our session today. I hope that we, as a society, leverage the challenges of 2020 as a platform to become a more inclusive, empathetic, and innovative community. Kevin, get us there.
Well, Marianne, that was the best introduction I've ever heard. So after this, can we talk about us going on the road and doing something? Wow, thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, and if Rachel, if you can let me know if my screen is up.
Yep, it all looks good.
Okay, great. So thank you, and thank you all who are on this call for taking your lunchtime to spend kind of just a few moments to listen to kind of my perspective, the Cavs perspective around this whole conversation about diversity, inclusion, engagement, equity. And I'm gonna go probably about 14, 15 minutes, and then we'll save some time for some Q&A. And please feel free to drop those questions in the chat. So back in March, when George Floyd was killed, and I guess that was May 25th, 2020, the whole world changed. And the whole world changed, and I would tell you that for me, I thought I was busy. I have never been busier. And the world changed as people were asking the question, wow, is this now just a moment, or is this really a movement? Like what's going on? And we saw companies that had never really talked about the whole conversation about diversity, inclusion, engagement, and fairness, actually writing checks for millions of dollars. And I will tell you from a job security standpoint, I never felt more secure as the hottest job in America, even today, is being a chief diversity officer. However, for me, because I've had a chance to live a bit of life, I've seen this before. I've seen a moment happen, society kind of rally around it and talk about it being a movement, but then it kind of dies out. Right now, to make sure that that moment when George Floyd was murdered is not just a moment, but it's actually a movement. Four areas in which I want to talk about. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of what this whole conversation is about DE&I. I'll talk about why it's important. I'll give you a glimpse of how we operationalize it with the Cavs, and then just a few points on how you can make a difference, regardless if it's an individual difference or professional difference. The first thing that I like to do is to level set. All three of these words have meaning to them. And I would be willing to wager that however many people on this call, if I would ask you to put in the chat what your definition of diversity is, we would find that we would have multiple definitions of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Fortunately or unfortunately, just depending on your perspective, I've been around long enough when it used to be multiculturalism moving into affirmative action and then into diversity without the I or the E. So I'm going to spend just a few moments just kind of going over kind of how we define it, how I define it, so that you understand the context of my conversation. So when we talk about what is diversity, most people will define it by listing characteristics of people, personal dimensions of people, thinking styles, ethnicity, race, gender. That is historically how people, when they hear the word diversity, and quite honestly, if we can keep it real, diversity for a long period of time has been equated to African American, or now kind of adding in the Latinx community, women, and maybe people from the LGBTQ community. But for the most part, it's always been a code word. When you say, oh, I'm going to bring in a diverse candidate, you would anticipate someone black or brown walking through that door. So when we think about just the personal dimensions of diversity, that is not how I define diversity. That's just describing how people are. I want to share with you the Cavs definition, and I promise you that it's going to be slightly different than maybe what you're thinking. Diversity is the collective mixture of our fans, team members, properties, partners, and our teams, characterized by our differences and similarities. So what we mean by this is that it's a collective mixture of everything that we are. And some of you may be thinking that, wow, you all just watered that definition down. No, what we have done is to make sure that it's inclusive. And one of the key phrases that's in our definition that a lot of people kind of push back on is like, Kevin, you were talking about diversity. What do you mean similarities? Well, I contend that if we continue to focus and define diversity on just what is different, then we're going to lose out on an opportunity to connect on what is similar. Most of us, most humans, do not like to be different and to stand out from everyone else. If you all were going tonight, if you go out and meet somebody new, one of the first things that we historically have done, just as people, is we try to find those commonalities. Oh, where do you live? I live on the west side. Oh, I live on the west side. I live on the east side. That's just natural. And the reason why we do that is because we're trying to find familiarity. We're trying to be comfortable, and thus trust can be built out of that. So for us, diversity is we look at it as just a noun. What is it? We clearly have defined diversity. So in our organization, when we use the word, we know what it means. And it is not a code word for Black. It's not a code word for white. It is a representation, a collective mixture of all of what we do based on our similarities and differences. When we talk about inclusion, and oftentimes people will just say D&I, and D&I now seems to be its own word. No, diversity is diversity, inclusion is inclusion. Inclusion for us is creating and fostering a trusting environment in which all are respected and engaged in the acceleration of our team priorities. This is beginning to be the first shift of connecting the work of diversity and inclusion to the business. When we talk about this connecting to our team priorities. So when we think about diversity, and that's a noun, when we think about inclusion, that is a verb. You have to do something. Simply stated, you can have diversity and not have inclusion. You can have diversity in your organization. We can have diversity in Cleveland and not have inclusion. Inclusion says we do word called equity. Years now, equity seems to be kind of a buzzword, Because to me, if you get the diversity piece correct, you get the inclusion piece, equity is going to naturally follow. That's going to be really the benefit of you doing the first two. When I talk about equity, we're talking about level setting the organizational landscape where all are empowered to be their authentic selves and contribute. So equity means that I am free to be who I am in my organization and contribute, that there are no barriers that are stopping me, or there aren't any additional types of supports that are artificial just because I'm a man of color in the organization. So let me define that from really just summarizing this. So equity is a principle, diversity is a noun, inclusion is a verb. I'm a visual person, and maybe this might help. Some of you may have seen this picture before. When I look at this picture, I see three individuals from a diversity perspective. Different heights, different hair color, different clothes, maybe different gender, who knows? But it may be different ages. But I have diversity in this picture. If I think about this picture as an organization, and the objective of the organization is for everybody in this picture to be able to participate and contribute, we have one person out of the three that can't contribute because they're not able to see. If seeing the field and seeing the game is the objective of the organization, we have one person, and based on their body language, you can see that they're not really happy about it with their hands down. So if I think about inclusion, and remember I told you, you have to do something to create an inclusive environment. The organization said, you know, why don't we add just another crate to the person on the right so that they can participate, that all three individuals can participate. So in the middle picture, I have inclusion, everybody is participating, although we have now artificially added something to the environment, to the culture, by taking one crate away from one individual, giving it to somebody else. And one of the downfalls when we do this work, and to be very, very, very clear, and again, just kind of directly speaking, is that white males often feel that something is being taken away from them in order for others to participate in the D&I equation. And in this case, that's absolutely kind of what we did. We took from one to give to the other so all can participate. But we do have inclusion. Here's what equity is. And from a systemic standpoint, and all of you have heard now recently about systemic racism, and we've heard about systemic issues. And the organization is saying, you know what? Let's take away the barrier that is stopping all three individuals to be themselves. Let's remove the fence, the wooden fence, and add another fence that is a chain fence if the objective is for everybody to see the game. Everybody is now standing on their own 2 feet. Everybody is actually participating. And that is when you have equity in an organization. No artificial stimulants, no artificial types of apparatus, but yet you remove the systemic barrier that was stopping these individuals. So hopefully this graphic and the words kind of help you in shaping how we think about DE&I. And with that, let me share with you kind of the next steps around how do you make sure that this is not just a moment, that the George Floyd murder all the way up to everything that even happened with the Capitol just a couple weeks ago, all of these events are leading up to a movement around social justice, racial justice from a business perspective. I want to share with you kind of the diversity and inclusion strategic platform that our organization has. And there's 5 different properties that I have a chance to oversee and lead in this space. So when I first came on board with the Cavs, the first thing that I did for 2 months of my coming on board, and this is last April of 2019, was I gathered as much internal information and external information as I could. My background is sales and marketing. I got a decade with P&G. We would never go to market with any product without understanding what the consumer wanted, as well as what our partners wanted from the suppliers, as well as our vendors. We would have a comprehensive database so that we can build a plan accordingly. I look at this work as the exact same way. So I gathered information and we built aspirations out of this. So what I'm going to share with you is our D&I platform. And these are aspirations, the aspirations of when we are successful, how will we know? It's when we hit these aspirations. Please know behind each one of these is our strategies, tactics, metrics, resources, timelines, just like anything else that we would do from a business perspective. So first, our team members, and we call our employees, our team members. Our aspiration is that our team members at all levels mirror the demographics of the communities that we live and work in. And again, there's strategies and tactics of how to get there. From a culture standpoint, our aspiration is to have an inclusive culture in which everyone is treated with dignity and respect. And let me just deviate for a moment. You saw that we had all these different properties. Well, we have the Canton Charge that is based out of Canton, that is our G League team, which is kind of the minor league team or the feeder league into the Cavs. Well, they gave us feedback through my assessment that they felt like they were second class to all the other teams, because they're in Canton, they're housed in the Canton Civic Center. Everybody else is housed in beautiful Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse. The accommodations were very different. So when we think about, and this is a great example of when I think about functional diversity, the feedback they gave us was no different than a person telling us how they felt. So it was like, wow, so if you all are feeling this way, obviously there's some things in which we need to do to create a more inclusive culture so that you feel that you're being treated with dignity and respect. So that's the functional diversity piece, and we have taken steps to make that happen. From a fan development standpoint, our objective is to provide a high quality, equitable experience for all of our fans. It doesn't matter if the fans are in Loudville or if they have their feet on the hardwood. We want to make sure that everybody, when they walk out, will say, my experience was commensurate with what I paid for, and I felt as though you were listening. An example of that, in Northeast Ohio, the Latin population is somewhere between 8 and 9%. If you walk into Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse today, you will not see one sign in Spanish. Seems to me that we have not provided a high quality, equitable experience for all of our fans. I will tell you that that's going to change. We're in the process of changing that. From a marketplace standpoint, we leverage diversity and inclusion to increase revenue and create and strengthen partnerships. We have several different things in which we've done that have driven bottom line and top line impact by engaging in communities that we typically did not engage in before from a marketplace standpoint. And then lastly, from a community standpoint, our objective, our aspiration is that we are relevant, trusted, and engaged with all the communities in which we live and serve and work in. Here's what that means. When I came back home to assume responsibilities, I knew what the Cavs meant in the community. I grew up here. I hadn't been here in 30 years. I asked a lot of community leaders across every dimension of diversity, what do you think about the Cavs? What can we do better? They're like, the Cavs are great as far as coming in and remodeling courts and gyms and giving out all sorts of tickets and balls and blah, blah, blah. I said, and then I asked, well, what about as far as just on an ongoing engagement standpoint? Are we in the community? Are we sitting at the table from a civic standpoint? They're like, nah, not so much. Not so much. So anybody would like you if you give them something, but if we are really relevant and trusted, that means that we're sitting at the table and it's not a transactional relationship. It's one from having a real authentic relationship. So those are the 5 areas. And the reason why these aren't pillars is that each one connects to the other. It's hard for me to be relevant and engaged and trusted in all communities if my team members don't feel that the culture in which they work in supports the values of the organization. It's hard for us to have team members that reflect all demographics, but yet our fans that reflect all aren't feeling as though they also are being cared for or taken care of. So with that, what can you do? And this is what I share on an ongoing basis nationally when I have these conversations. The first thing is around educating yourself and colleagues around what the issues and opportunities to impact change personally and in the community. There are things in which you can do to make the difference in this space, but if you're not educated, then it's going to be really what we think based off of emotion, not what we think based off of data. Becoming anti-racist and understanding what allyship is. Being an anti-racist means if I see something, regardless of who it affects, if I see something wrong, I'm going to call it out. See something, say something. Being an ally doesn't mean that I'm on the sidelines just saying, hey, I support you. It means getting in the boat with individuals from different walks of life and understanding as close as you can what their challenges are. So when they're not around, you would have understood what their challenges are and you can be a voice for them as well. I want to encourage you to build a sustainable and strategic D&I plan. Everything I share with you from a plan standpoint, and that was, again, high level, it's connected to the development and compensation of all of our executives. And then lastly, supporting economic empowerment for Black and other understood and misunderstood and underserved oppressed communities. My vision for how we begin to create change in the community is when, from an economic standpoint, we have leveled the playing field. As long as we have and have-nots from an economic standpoint, we will have healthcare disparities, we'll have food desert disparities, we'll have education disparities. But these are all things in which we individually can do and then collectively within your organizations as well. So with that, I know I kind of rushed through that. Believe me, that is a whole 4-hour session that I typically would do, but let me take any questions.
Absolutely. We've had a couple questions come in. So to start, is there a step beyond movement? And how do we reach that? Asking because we've had movements and we've seen some change, but there are still disparities. I'm curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the step towards a movement, and the reason why I call it from a movement standpoint, why I'm stressing that, is that where we will ultimately want to go is when it just becomes a fabric of the community or the fabric of your organization. That is the end goal of the movement. But the movement itself it's necessary because that a movement is the ability for us to garner the support to actually be successful. So yes, the end goal is sustainability, where it becomes part of the fabric of your organization or the fabric of a community, but you need a movement to kind of get started. So the movement is the vehicle to get you to the sustainability.
Can you speak to some of the work that you and the Cavs have done with other professional sports teams in town?
Oh, somebody set me up for that question. Yeah, so I absolutely have the honor to be able to lead the 3-team alliance. And I say the honor because the GMs of all 3 teams had asked me to lead that. So we have a 3-team alliance that is focused on social justice. We were involved in voting. We were involved in education, as well as we're involved in the law enforcement system. And there are other kind of things in which we're doing relative to right now with the vaccination. You will see the 3-team alliance beginning with PSAs. You'll see us using our facilities for vaccination locations, as well as you're going to see education forums that will be driven by the 3-team alliance. So we know that sports can drive change, and particularly in Cleveland, where everybody's excited about our 3 sports teams, that we're leveraging that platform to help drive change in the community.
So you shared the box image, and that's very powerful. Is there another example you can give on true equity and how to ensure we aren't just moving boxes around in the workplace?
Right. So the first thing that you need to do is to make sure that you're defining equity for your organization. As far as ways to ensure that it's really sustainable, and this is what the last point that I had made, and maybe it wasn't really clear, is that every organization, every person in every organization is typically driven by a handful of things. One of which is when any type of requirement is tied to performance development, and then recognition and reward. We've tied kind of our work to all 4 of those. so that it's just part of what is in the day-to-day expectation of our organization, and it's not a one-off. It's not part of a movement. The work in which I shared with you didn't happen because of George Floyd. It started last April 2019 when I first got here. We fortunately had a platform to make a change in the community based off of the fact that we already had a platform in place. So my summation of that is make sure that you tie the work to that motivates people on an ongoing basis. Diversity cannot be over here and then the work of the organization is over here. It has to be integrated.
So looking around professional sports, WNBA, NBA have really been leaders in this DE&I work. What's next for the Cavs and the NBA to keep making this a movement and not just a moment?
Yep. So the NBA, and I'll start there first, just announced actually towards the latter part of the year where they had stood up the first social justice foundation. Each one of the NBA teams on an annual basis gives $1 million to that foundation, and it's a 10-year commitment. So that's $300 million. And it's for social justice projects, organizations, and communities on an ongoing basis. So that's at the league level. That's a $300 million commitment. The focus of that is around education in the Black community and the empowerment of businesses. So very similar to what I shared before, trying to help the Black community really to be self-sustainable so that from an economic standpoint, they have the resources to kind of stand on their own 2 feet. From a Cavs perspective, what we're doing, and you're probably seeing more of me and more of my colleagues than you probably want to, we're taking an active role from a civic standpoint. We know, like for instance, that Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse, that building belongs to this community. That's why we really fought hard to make sure it was a voting precinct. That's why we're right now preparing to make sure that, well, we do food drives out of Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse. We want to make sure that from a vaccination standpoint, that as soon as there's enough vaccine available, that we can also have the building as a vaccination location. So we're really amping up on connecting with the city and the county as they had the declaration of racism being a public health crisis. We've taken those 6 different areas to focus on education, food deserts, health, transportation, and empowerment, economic empowerment. So we've aligned our work to connect to the community.
So both as your role within an organization and as someone who is involved in the community, very engaged in the community, what advice do you have for those who are embarking on this work where they might not have full organizational support or might be trying to find their way in the community? How do they keep moving forward and not get burned out with potential barriers they run into?
So this work is hard enough to do when you have a complete organization to support you. What I would suggest is, 1, do research on what nonprofits exist in the community to kind of bring together others to support you. Secondly, what I would do, when I mentioned around the education piece, continue to educate and share that education. Thirdly, the thing that I love about our city is that there are a number of companies, there are a number of companies that have formed kind of alliances to do this work collectively, and they're pretty easy to find. And then lastly, in which I'll throw it out to, and at risk of getting a lot of emails, if whoever asks that question, if I can be of any support and guidance, I'm at Clayton@Cavs.com. Did I just do that?
And we do have it recorded, so.
Yes, no, please, I'm more than happy to engage in any conversation. I see a few familiar faces on here that would vouch for our ability to help and connect.
And Kevin, we have time for one more question. And so for those of us who are here on this call today, what can we do to help continue to support your work and the work of the Cavs in the community?
Well, I appreciate that question. One is that as you see the different things that we're doing, if you're supportive of it, like hopefully a number of you have seen the new, what used to be the LeBron Wall, the Sherwin-Williams building, which is for the love for the land, which that was our way of saying unity is important to Ohio. So when you see things from a social media standpoint, please let the rest of the community know that you support that. If you have ideas that you want to share that you think we can be doing something different, you got my email. And then lastly, if you could allow us to maybe partner with you on some of the things you're doing, we are more than happy to do that. So those would be the three things that I say right off the bat would be helpful, and just making sure that this is a community-led type of opportunity. And I do bring the Browns and the Indians to the table around this work as well.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much for your time today. And thank you for all you are doing, both within your organization and in our community. We are so incredibly thankful to have you back here.
Rachel, I'm honored to be able to speak to the folks today. So thank you.